Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event to launch UNSW's new Gendered Violence Strategy and Action Plan, and for panel discussion with UNSW students and researchers on the role men can play to tackle gendered violence. This is part of UNSW's events for Respect Week 2022, which is a collaboration between ARC and UNSW's Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Division. I want to begin today by acknowledging that UNSW is located on the unceded lands of the Bidjigal people, the Gadigal people, and the Ngunnawal people. Personally, I'm on Bidjigal land today for this event, and as a person who is a fairly recent migrant to Australia, I want to acknowledge that my life and my work here all occurs on unceded, stolen lands. I want to pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us here today. Here at UNSW, we know that addressing gendered violence, including sexual violence and sexual harassment, is not just an issue for women and gender diverse people. It is everyone's responsibility to address this, not just by calling it out in others, but also, and more importantly, by addressing harmful beliefs that we may have ourselves. The recent National Student Safety Survey found that 1 in 6 students have experienced some form of sexual harassment while attending university. UNSW cannot and will not accept this as a standard of safety for its community. So today, we are joined by the Vice-Chancellor and the President of UNSW, Professor Attila Brungs, who will launch the university's new Gendered Violence Strategy and Action Plan. And this will be followed by a panel discussion with UNSW students and researchers who will explore what all of us, especially men, can do to tackle sexual harassment and assault. I want to now hand over to the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Attila Brungs.
Thank you, Timothy. I really appreciate your very warm welcome, and thank you for your work on this. I would also like to acknowledge the Bidjigal people, the traditional owners on the land on which we stand. I also often say I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present to be the traditional custodians of knowledge for this place. Knowledge is at the heart of what we are as a university. Now, as we launch this incredible strategy today, knowledge is actually at the heart. Knowledge, people's lived experiences, it's at the heart of the evidence base, which this strategy has developed with the communities across UNSW to tackle a really insidious issue. Knowledge has the power to make real change for good, as well as acknowledging when things aren't right, as well as acknowledging personal accountability and responsibility in actions. So I'd like to warmly welcome everyone to this panel discussion that comes to the launch, Stop, Empower, Support, the UNSW's Gendered Violence Strategy and Action Plan. The strategy, of course, as you know, was developed by the Gendered Violence Research Network, co-designed with a broad community of students and staff. I'm very pleased to see, as on the line there, Madeleine Suchton, the manager of UNSW's Gendered Violence Research Network, here today. Thank you for joining us. So too on the panel are other members involved in developing the strategy, including Angela Griffin, the ARC, EDI and Projects Coordinator, and of course, as you heard from Timothy O'Leary, the UNSW Gender Champion. I would like to take this moment to thank everybody who made a contribution, especially the victim survivors who bravely shared their experiences and suggestions on how we can do better. I'd also like to thank all the students and staff who contributed to the development of the strategy through either focus groups, online interviews, surveys, or just coming up to one of us and giving us some great ideas. It has been a real community effort. One of the core next steps, of course, is that I will co-chair a steering group with Professor Arlene Baldry, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at EDI. And this committee will oversee the implementation of the strategy. Strategies are great, implementations are even better, okay, as we want to make real change. What we need to do is make our campus safe for everyone. The aim of Stop, Empower, Support Strategy and Action Plan is to stop gendered violence on our campuses through prevention, through education, through all of our collective individual behaviour. Empower people to create a safe and respectful community by calling out inappropriate behaviour when it is safe to do so, and with the expectation, the real expectation, that students and staff model respectful behaviour. Also, finally, of course, support our students and staff to raise their concern, report incidences, and seek the best support possible when they need it. Launching this strategy in Respect Week is particularly pertinent because I believe respect is at the heart of creating a safe and thriving community for University of New South Wales, but in society more broadly. Respect is at the heart of many things we do. And for me, this strategy is something I'm particularly focused on. It comes off the back of the National Safety Student Survey and Respect at Work reports. Both of these showed incredible evidence of the sexual harassment and sexual assault amongst university students and staff, both on campus and off campus, that they're prevalent and that they have profound impacts. I'm sure many of you will have also, like me, read that entire report, read the stories of the victim survivors. It was incredibly confronting. It includes insights, however, and that's where these brave people put their stories forward. This gives us the knowledge, as I spoke about, to target things better. One of the insights was that gender and sexually diverse students, as well as young women and students with disability, are disproportionately impacted. This enables us to target specific things to different communities. Overall, as I said, the results are unacceptable. There is no place for sexual harassment or assault in society, let alone on our campus, let alone in a university that should be about improving people's lives, should be about improving society. That's the point of a public university. Universities hold a unique place in societies, and we have a unique opportunity to make a difference in overcoming gender violence, not just on campus, but across society. We should not underestimate what such a powerful force universities can be. So, as employers, we have a large sphere of influence. We must improve awareness, set expectations, promote actions that shape behavior in this workplace. But as a university, by shaping these behaviors, by guiding cultures, we have brilliant students, and community goes out and they will shape the workplaces and homes across Australia for years to come. So if anybody needs to take this seriously, we do too. One, to make sure that our campus is safe. Two, to make sure we use this responsibility as a university to change society as a whole. And I know that sounds like a big collective action, but it starts off about each and every one of us as individuals acts, behaves, and models behavior. Each and every one of us as an individual can make a real difference to this by calling out inappropriate behaviors when safe to do so, by supporting people as appropriate. So as I said, that starts with me, and I make a commitment to all of you and in front of all of you that I will do everything I can as my own personal accountability and in my role at the university to make sure that this wonderful strategy is as successful as it can be. So today's discussion will have a lot of thought. Panel members will share how they reflected on their own behavior, confronted their own prejudices, what they're doing now, and importantly, talk about the role men have to play in combating gendered violence. All are quite difficult topics. As I'm sure for many of us, it's hard to admit that our own behavior, our language, particularly when it's unconscious, may have been lacking at some point in our lives, may need to change. But again, one of the joys of universities, we develop new knowledge, we change. Universities are about change. So out of today, I want to call you all to action. Report misconduct, sexual misconduct through online portals, be a champion for change. Be a champion for calling out respectful behaviors. Be a champion for using your own behavior to demonstrate and model where we want to be. And I know that this culture of integrity and respect that we have at UNSW can be made stronger. Once again, I thank you for your participation. And importantly, I thank you for all your efforts in the years to come to make sure we tackle this together. Timothy, back to you.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. Thank you for that introduction and that launch and those really, I think, inspiring words for all of us. And I think we certainly really share that ambitious vision that what we're talking about here is something which really is, as you said, it's big action, it's big change, it's something really fundamental, and it's something that challenges everybody. And I think that's really part of the message and part of what we're going to talk about today is how that does challenge everybody. Everybody needs to respond in some way, depending on their context, as is appropriate for them. Everybody needs to take up that challenge. So let me introduce the panel. First of all, myself, which I neglected to do earlier on. So I am Timothy O'Leary. I am a gender champion, one of the gender champions at UNSW. I'm also head of the School of Humanities and Languages in the Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture. And on the panel joining us today, we have, first of all, Mei-Lin Suchting. Mei-Lin is the manager of the Gendered Violence Research Network here at UNSW. And the gendered violence strategy has been developed by the GVRN, and Mei-Lin had a key role in that, and I'll be coming to her in a minute to talk to her about that. We're also joined by Nick Palmer, who is the Student Representative Council's General Secretary. Nick is a current student at UNSW. He's doing a dual degree in Arts and Science, and he's majoring in Physics and Philosophy. And we're joined by Angela Griffin, Ange is the ARC EDI and Projects Coordinator, and she's also a project officer with the GBRN. And Ange is a very recent graduate in honors in social science. And I'll be asking her a little bit about that also in a minute, because it happens to be precisely on the topics her thesis was precisely on the topics we're talking about today. And finally, we're joined by Vincent Breckenridge. Vincent, thank you for joining us. Vincent is a second-year UNSW student, also doing double degree in arts and science. And we'll talk to Vince about some of his experiences as a student in the university very soon. So let me begin, Maylene. I want to turn to you, since you were involved, obviously, very closely, instrumentally in developing the strategy. We've heard from the Vice-Chancellor of the importance of the big action call out for changing not only things that we know we're doing, but even changing unconscious forms of behavior and prejudice, maybe, and ideas that some of us might have. And I note that in the new strategy, one of the priorities, priority number 5, is about culture change. So what do we do to change the culture? And that's really something we want to do today, is talk about how do we shift that? How do we shift the culture in amongst staff and students at the university? And then, of course, more broadly, as the Vice-Chancellor has pointed out, as we can all do in our daily lives. So Maylene, on culture change, what is culture change? What aspects need to be changed, and how do we do that?
Thank you, Timothy. And I just wanted to say thank you to the VC as well for such warm words and for such an incredible launch of the strategy. I also just want to acknowledge that I am sitting today on Wadi land, and to acknowledge all of those custodians of this beautiful place. Culture change. I'm glad that you started with a small question, Timothy. But I did want to say to you that already and always UNSW demonstrates this. So this strategy is actually about a move from a focus on sexual misconduct to a focus on gendered violence. So it is a culture change piece to actually widen the scope. And that is acknowledging of the variety of different experiences, and also the diversity of our university population, both staff and students. So by widening the scope, what we're doing is actually saying that in order to challenge the variety of different behaviours, we have to take a deep look at all of them. And that means looking at the intersections of different behaviours as well, and also the intersections of the experiences of different students. So the other thing that is a culture change piece, and that's significant in this strategy, is that it is a whole of organisation response, already led by our VC, but it is about staff and students. And that's really, really important, because we all deserve to work and study in a safe environment. And so I think that the reach of this strategy demonstrates where we need to change the culture, but the actual doing, as the VC said to us all, the implementation piece is the next call to action, the challenge. And I guess what we're wanting to say is this is something for all of us to be involved in.
Yeah, great.
So
Thank you. Thank you, Maylene. Thank you. And yes, indeed. And in fact, today's event, of course, is also a part of that shift. Right. I think one of the things that we're doing is to, in beginning these discussions, broadening the range of people with whom we have these discussions. I think that this is a very important step also in that. And of course, having that strategy as a guide and having the vision of that strategy is, as you said, really important. And it is really heartening to see that our institution and from the very top does that, and also down, of course, to the students within the university, which is wonderful. Look, we will come back to some of the details of the strategy document perhaps later on, but I want to turn now to Angela Griffin. Ange, I know that your honors thesis, as I said, you've recently graduated with an honors thesis in social science. Congratulations on that, first of all. And I know that your thesis actually addressed some aspects of these questions, and you looked at how student representatives felt universities had incorporated their voices in their gendered violence governance. And of course, that raises the question of the way the way that the institution, what systems the university has in place, really, as the Vice-Chancellor said, to call out behaviors and to support victims of unacceptable behavior. So I want to begin then by asking you, what were the findings of your honours thesis? How satisfied or not satisfied were student representatives in relation to the way that their universities, and not just this university, of course, handle these questions?
Thanks, Timothy. Yeah, so in my honours thesis, I looked at universities across New South Wales, so it certainly wasn't just UNSW. And what I found was that students, essentially the Change the Course report was released in 2017, and it was a really important document that really pushed a lot of universities to improve their actions when it came to responding and preventing sexual violence on campus. And what I found was that in the immediate aftermath of that report's release, student representatives were largely really happy with how they were incorporated in governance processes. So they felt like there were a lot of spots on boards and committees for student representatives, and they felt like there was real change happening on campus. But in the subsequent years, students started to feel a little bit less like they were being involved. And partially that was to do with COVID-19, and there was a lot of focus being placed on the response to such a huge crisis, and possibly some other issues were being put on the back burner. But I think students were feeling a lot less involved in decision making in the subsequent years beyond that report's release. So I think that with the National Student Safety Survey release and also the Gender Violence Strategy release, I think it will be a really good opportunity to re-engage student representatives in decision-making processes, because students are so vital to providing that real lived experience and that insight into what students really need. They're experts in their own experiences. So having students on decision-making boards and committees is so beneficial to making sure that these processes are fit to purpose.
Right. Thank you, Ange. Thank you. Definitely. Look, can I turn now perhaps to Nick Palmer. So Nick, you are General Secretary of the the SRC. And of course also a current student. From your position in that as General Secretary and as a student, what do you think are the, how should I put this? I mean, we're talking about culture change and talking about the role that men can have in for instance, in calling out forms of behavior around harassment and so on. Do you see any change? Have you seen any changes, or what do you think further needs to be done, and what kind of role could bodies like the SRC, for instance, have in taking more action?
I think it's one of those things that always, you can always, it seems, say there's more that could be done, but it's really, I guess, from the point of view of, engaging with men and acknowledging their, position as, most of the time, statistically perpetrators of gendered violence. I guess it's a cultural thing, and it's a thing where really making sure we're engaging in, the broadest kind of activities. And it's because it's so pervasive, unfortunately, it's really, I guess, from the SRC's point of view, making sure we find avenues to, engage throughout the whole student body and the different clubs. And I guess just, because it's UNSW, it's such a broad university. Like it's not like we can go into one room and say, that's it, we've spoken to everyone about this and we know everyone knows it. And unfortunately, I think as well, it's one of those things where making sure people know it and making sure people can fully understand it can be so difficult. And I think especially, unfortunately, for men, I know plenty of men offhand that they don't necessarily appreciate just how pervasive it is and really their role in trying to just get rid of what is, really an unfortunate and something that just can't be tolerated thing that happens in society, but it can be quite difficult, I think, to communicate that properly.
Yes, indeed. Okay, thank you, Nick. And maybe I'll turn now to Vincent, just on that question of, of the pervasiveness, broadly speaking, of disrespectful behaviors, pervasiveness of harassment and so on. And as Nick has said, statistically, the largest number of perpetrators of sexual harassment and gendered violence are men. What do you see, Vincent, as a second-year student at UNSW? What do you see in culture specifically amongst male students at the university around these questions? Is there a pervasive disrespectfulness? Is there an unwillingness on the part of men to change and to recognize forms of behavior?
Well, I would say that firstly, I started off with university in 2020, so I had quite an interrupted start to my university education. But coming back into it, I was initially pretty surprised by how much access to this sort of information about sexual harassment and about the proper conduct on campus that we had. We had a sexual conduct awareness form that we had to fill out, and we had a lot of our lecturers in our initial classes coming out to us and saying, or sort of delineating what the proper behavior was with a lot of this sort of stuff. And initially, I think, I personally don't have an issue with accepting that, but I think with a lot of the friend groups that I associate with, it seems like some people sort of fundamentally reject that, that premise. But at university itself, and with the students that I've interacted with, I've seen a very positive environment surrounding that sort of behavior. I've noticed that in opposition to my school environment, my school was co-ed, but with university, there seems to be a lot more mixing between men and women when it comes to where we sit and how we interact. And I think that's a very positive thing to see. And it's also an issue, I think, that it's not very explicit within the university environment. Any behavior that might be problematic in this sort of thing, from my perspective as someone who's never been on the receiving end of such behavior, it seems to be implicit. It seems to happen on a very small scale, and it seems to happen, and not to say that it isn't still problematic, but it doesn't seem to happen on a very pervasive scale, at least at UNSW in my experience. So I would say that coming into UNSW, I had a very positive experience with that sort of thing, which isn't to say there aren't problems with it still, perhaps. But I think the continued access to awareness about what constitutes misconduct in this field really helps us sort of understand foundationally what's okay to do at university. And so for that, I think generally it's been very positive at UNSW for me.
Great, thank you, Vincent. And you do raise a very important question there, which is if an individual has not themselves been a victim of these forms of disrespectful behavior, they may not notice it occurring around them. They may be less attuned, I suppose, to seeing it around them. And one of the challenges, when one talks about the necessity of men to be active bystanders, the first thing, of course, is to notice what is happening, notice the forms of behavior, the forms of speech, and so on, which can range from the extremely subtle to the very, very blatant. I wonder if Nick, could you respond to that? I mean, or to just say something about what are the barriers to noticing that for people who themselves may not be victims of forms of disrespectful behavior? How does such a person, whether that is myself or Vinny or you, begin to notice forms of disrespectful behavior that are not acceptable?
I think there's a lot of steps you can take. I think especially if you were not aware and you were really scratching your head. I know that through my workplace, I've done gendered violence training. I found that immensely helpful. And it's really understanding that it's as a bystander, as someone who has other male friends, it's knowing that there's, really small things that can end up leading to larger patterns of behavior, and just knowing that, there's things that aren't okay and there's things that might be red flags for you to say, hold on, mate, that's not quite is, because you don't want it to, obviously escalate to, being surrounded by people that are, committing gendered violence, because that's just, it's not okay at the start to be one, disrespectful, and it's just really calling it out before you see it and challenging people on it. And it's an active thing, and it's something that I think I have to always as well myself refresh and make sure I'm keeping up with.
Yeah, totally. And that raises the very important point of the question of the connection or the continuity between, let's say, micro forms of aggression or what may seem to some people to be quite small disrespectful acts, and how that connects up then potentially with larger forms, with sexual harassment, sexual assault, gendered violence, and so on. Maybe I could turn to you, Mei-Lin, as someone who researches in this area. What does the research tell us about the importance of that, calling out the small forms of behavior that perhaps one could sort of overlook, the importance of calling them out, because they actually are things that may be either indications that there's a more serious problem, or else that perhaps even they may be kind of the first step towards a person engaging in more serious behavior. What is that connection between the small forms of maybe disrespectful speech and the much bigger forms of coercive behavior and gendered violence and so on?
I think you've already shaped that picture really in the question, Timothy. Disrespect does start in some ways, some of those what might be invisible type issues. We talk a lot in the work that we do, and which is training work as well as writing research pieces about microaggressions, about the intersections between sexual and racialized comments, put downs, subtle sorts of, we all know that what can be acceptable in cultural and social contexts can be those sorts of put downs, and we might let something slide thinking that it's actually not intended to be hurtful, but it is in many instances hurtful and might be a pointer to other disrespectful behaviour. So certainly that's what the research then tends to indicate. And I think that it can be as much a challenge to raise those issues in social situations as it can be to take a big stand. Just being visited by my dog, just letting you all know that.
Okay, sorry. We can't hear your dog. That's fine.
Okay, apologise.
But I think that you do also, you finish there. I'm going to turn to Ange in 1 second, but you raise that very interesting question that it can be, as a bystander, it can be almost more difficult to call out the small microaggression than it is to intervene in the larger. If you see someone physically being assaulted, that might be easier, maybe easier to do something. Whereas if your friend or someone in your social network makes a throwaway passing comment, it can be harder, socially speaking, or more awkward to get over that. Is that right? That's in some sense, oddly, the small things are more difficult than the big things.
Well, perhaps I could just add to that to say I think we've probably all experienced it, those moments where we're not quite sure whether or not to make a comment. What's it going to mean to our friendship? What's it going to mean to the social network? How will you be positioned for taking a stand? And so we need to practice it with each other. We need to be bold. Yeah. We all need to know that everyone is challenged by it. Those of us embedded in this work for a long time, as well as those new to it. And to seize the challenge and think about what we'd like to experience ourselves. I think that's usually the biggest test.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Mei-Lin. Ange, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I think that what we've just talked about is really the essence of what men can do in this space, because those small comments, I think we've all experienced when someone has made a truly, like, often people don't even mean anything by it. They're just sort of like unaware that this sort of speech isn't really acceptable, or they're just sort of making a joke and they're not really sure that they're not really aware that it's actually not okay. But, I've experienced before where myself or one of my women or non-binary friends have called out something like this, and then we kind of get labeled as shrill or joy killers. Whereas if a man does the same thing, it's not seen in the same way. So I think like that really does speak to the essence of what men can do in this space, is that men have power in these sorts of environments where they can call out things where I couldn't. And I think I know it can be like really difficult to know what to do, and it can be really uncomfortable to call out friends, but I think it can be done in a really low key kind of like, I know you didn't mean anything by that, but maybe don't say that again kind of way, that like can be, it's a small thing, but it can be really, really helpful. And it can also sort of indicate to the women and non-binary people that are in the space watching this, it can show them that you're an ally to them and that you want to be that safe person. So I think like, although it can be scary, it's such an important act.
Yep, great. Thank you, Angela. I think, yeah, I mean, certainly from my own experience, I would say, that there definitely is a learning curve. That has been for me over I would say over decades, a learning curve in recognizing the harm that these forms of microaggression can have, recognizing them as microaggressions and then their harm, and then of course also recognizing the role that they play in much bigger systems in holding certain power structures in place. That these are not, I mean, they may be micro, but the micro is extremely important in this regard, because that's in one sense what that builds up and that holds the larger structure in place. And I'm just wondering if maybe if Nick or Vincent, if you could, has there been for you? I know you're not as old as I am, so you haven't had as many decades of a learning curve. But I mean, I know that I remember one of the things that you said, Vinny, was a difference between your secondary school and university, for instance, and how that culture is different. Has there been is there anything that you could share just personally in that learning curve for you and coming to recognize and perhaps even being able to intervene, or at least being able to recognize forms of behavior as harmful that you did not recognize before? Is that?
Yeah. Well, during high school, I was sort of part of a very homogenous group of boys in the friends group. You know what I mean? We didn't really we didn't really have that many female friends by comparison. And I think when you're in those sort of circles, it's easy for it to turn into an echo chamber where you sort of embody these sort of problematic ideas. And learning to call that out is very intimidating, I think, for young men. Because although it's objectively the right thing to do, I think there's sort of a sense of insecurity that you won't be seen as masculine if you're not embodying these traditionally masculine characteristics. So I think when you come to uni and when you have more access to this sort of to gender diversity, to the diversity of opinion in general, I think it becomes easier for you to recognize when something wrong is said. And I think it becomes easier for you to stand up and say, this is wrong in this situation, because now you have the equipment to be able to deal with that sort of thing with the education that we have in university about these problems.
Yeah.
I think the school system is getting better in that matter as well, by the way. I don't really want to create this false dichotomy between school systems and university systems. This is just my subjective experience, but yeah.
Yeah, and you raise the you indicate the very important element here, which is the homogeneous group. And of course, homogeneous groups will tend to develop that kind of, a kind of a hostility, perhaps potential hostility or disregard for people who are outside of that group. And also the issue of masculinity and the idea that a lot of men perhaps have, that certain forms of behavior are more masculine than other forms of behavior, and that somehow disrespectful speech towards women or non-men, people of genders other than different other genders, disrespectful forms of speech and behavior are actually in some way inherently masculine, and that prove something about the kind of man you are in a positive sense. I wonder, Nick, if you, I mean, again, from your position as SRC General Secretary and as a student, is that changing? I mean, so much has changed in the last 10 to 20 years in relation to cultural expectations and cultural discourse around gender. Has it changed, or is there still that idea, do you think, amongst male students that calling out those forms of behavior in some way is some kind of betrayal of masculinity?
I definitely think there has been some change. I mean, obviously, it's not like I've had a very long period of time to notice it, but over the last 5 years at uni, I definitely would say, even in how well known some of the campaigns that have been run by student associations and the National Union of Students, etc., when it comes to sexual violence and gendered violence, it's definitely become much more known and much more accepted that there is an issue, which is, I think, first, recognizing there's an issue, and the first step you normally take in anything. But I think as well, any kind of pushback from sections of the student body definitely have faded over the time that I've been here. I know there's been like a number of things. I think when I was at university early on, there was even some protests about a speaker. I forget the whole situation there, but yeah, I know that became more normalized, and we've probably been seeing less and less of that. And but as I always say, it's an ongoing thing, and I think it's one of those things where we just have to, I guess, as well as for the Student Representative Council, there is a degree where we're holding the university to account, for better or worse. It's not to say we outright dislike the university. We love being students here, and we really see an important part in what we have to do there. And so it is always making sure that things are moving forward, and if they're not moving forward, figuring out where the system is breaking down, because it is a very complicated thing to handle. Yeah, great. Yeah, and look, and I think it definitely is a matter of, well, I mean, I think for all of us to hold the institution to account, but especially, of course, for universities, students have a really important role, and bodies like the SRC have a very important role in channeling that to the university to make sure that the university takes these issues seriously, which I believe the university does, as we've seen today. I want to turn to another aspect, one aspect that's been raised, or one element that's been raised, again, on the idea of the homogenous group, but this time not the homogenous male group, but a group that's homogenous in any number of other ways in terms of cultural diversity, ethnicity, linguistic diversity, and so on, and gender diversity. And maybe turn to you, Maylene, and just ask about, in terms of gendered violence in general, can you tell us something about the different ways that gendered violence will impact different groups of people? How it might impact people of color, or people who are non-binary people, trans people, and so on. How is this? How complex, let's say, is this field of the negative impacts of gendered violence, broadly speaking? That it's because it to the extent that it impacts different groups of people differently, how aware do we need to be of that, and what do we know about that as researchers?
So the first thing I want to say in relation to this is that gender violence impacts all communities. That's really important, and it does impact cis and trans men as well, but not to the same extent. So what we know is that all women, cis and trans, girls, and LGBTIQ+ communities are disproportionately affected. We also know that people living with disability are disproportionately affected. It's really important that we take that into account. And once you start to think about that, what we're also looking at is the intersection of different forms of discrimination. So that gendered violence and the experience of gendered violence might be the culmination of the impact of a range of different experiences, but also access to services and access to redress, and silencing can also happen for particular communities. So there's there's an impetus for all of us from what we know now to take up and stand as allies with many different communities in order to raise and I guess to create a safer UNSW, but also a safer world. We have so much evidence of this now that we really, really need to seize the challenge and to pay attention. But I did want to pick up on another point that relates to men's involvement as well, and that is that we've already said that perpetrators are disproportionately represented as men, but that is not saying that all men are perpetrators. And there can be a defensiveness that occurs for men who are trying to take a stand around these issues, as if all men are seen as perpetrators. And I guess what I want to say is this is part of the culture change piece for UNSW, but for all of us to keep reminding ourselves about this. There are, and we don't know, we can't actually quantify the number of perpetrators. It's not something you can study. People don't readily put up their hand in a population-based survey and say that, yes, they've perpetrated gendered violence. So I guess what I'd like to do is to introduce that into this discussion as well and say it's a reminder for all of us, but also if any men feel uncertain about standing up against these issues, you need to know that you're backed by a community that actually understands that men are an important part of challenging these issues, and also challenging perpetrators.
Yeah. Thank you, Marion. I think that is indeed a really important reminder that not all men or all of any other group are perpetrators. Although, on the other hand, I think we could probably agree that all men do have responsibility when it comes to responding to these forms of behavior, which is really why part of the reason why we're here today is to talk about those forms of that form of responsibility. So just coming back to the issue of intersectionality, Ange, I might come to you, and I mean in your role as ARC EDI project coordinator. From a student perspective, how complex are those intersections between, say, socioeconomic status, cultural linguistic background, sexual orientation, gender identity, and so on? How complex are those, and what does that kind of add to the challenges of addressing these issues?
I think incredibly important. These intersections can have huge impacts. I think, we've already talked about the increased risk that students from these sort of equity backgrounds face in experiencing gendered violence. But once a person has experienced gendered violence, there's also increased barriers that those students face to seeking justice and to seeking support as well. Language is a huge one. Part of my other role at Gender Violence Research Network was we did a number of consultations with students in the formation of the gender violence strategy. And in those consultations, we spoke to a number of international students and students from linguistically different backgrounds, so non-English as first language. And those students were really wanted to get the point across that information about gendered violence at UNSW, but also in Australia broadly, is really difficult to access if you're someone who doesn't speak English particularly well. And I think that's an area that we really need to improve here at UNSW. If you're a student with disability who's already struggling to access university resources, adding gendered violence experiences to your life, it makes it a lot more difficult. So not only are those students more at risk, they're also experiencing a lot more barriers as well. I think that's really important to note.
Yep, thank you. And just follow up one of those points, and perhaps pass it back to Marion again, on the question of access to information and reporting systems and support and so on. I know that the GVRN is closely involved. In fact, it manages the reporting structures at UNSW. Are there any changes, any improvements being made to that, or how do you think that? How do you think those structures operate? How well do they operate at UNSW at the moment in terms of? I believe there was some worrying feedback from students in the national survey, a large number of students who said that in their universities they wouldn't know how to report an incident. How do you think UNSW fares in that regard?
I think we have a communication piece to undertake to make the reporting portal at UNSW much more visible, both to staff and students. It is being used, and there are really, I think that when somebody does use the portal, and it can be used anonymously as well as in an identified way, that good information is provided to that reporter as long as the details for contact are offered. But so many people, and I think students and staff, are just not aware of the portal. I think this is probably really what the Universities of Australia found more broadly across universities, but we definitely need to pick up the challenge. And the other thing is that because the new strategy now widens to gendered violence, the portal will also widen to hear to take reports about a wider range of issues. So not the umbrella of sexual misconduct only, but also to include domestic family violence, intimate partner violence, dating violence, hazing, and certainly some of those issues already come to the portal just by virtue of it being the only place to lodge those reports. But we definitely need to make it very clear what the university has to offer here, and make it much more visible to students and to staff.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Millian. Yes, definitely. There's a big challenge there in communicating that and making sure that people that everybody knows where they can report and get support, especially those who need it in the moment. So look at another side of that, which has been raised earlier on in some of the comments, is around then training, and both Nick and Vincent talked about that, and myself as well, that experience of coming to recognize forms of behavior, learning to recognize forms of behavior, and learning how to effectively intervene to call out forms of behavior. And of course, that's not something that one learns necessarily on one's own, or one immediately kind of knows. It's something. It should be a part of one's education, right? So I guess I just wanted to ask, first of all, just again from the current student perspective for Nick and Vincent, have you had any training? Has your university or your school, perhaps in secondary school, given you any training in bystander, being an active bystander, or calling out forms of behavior, or is it just something that you kind of pick up as you go along as best you can? Maybe start with you, Vincent.
Okay. I think it's a combination of both. I think you both pick up sort of certain standards of behavior on when to speak up with this sort of thing, but I think it's also important to have a baseline knowledge of what the university considers to be standards for that sort of behavior as well. And it's like I said earlier, we had education about sexual misconduct before courses started. And we also have very stringent standards imposed from professors in lectures and stuff and that sort of thing as well. And to me personally, it doesn't feel like we're lacking, but that's sort of just my opinion as well. I completely understand if some people feel that sort of access to information is inadequate. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about it.
Okay, great. Thank you. And what about you, Nick? From an SRC perspective, is there any training that happens? Should there be more? What should we be doing?
I know from an SRC point of view, we have pretty broad induction where we have, we talk about a lot of kind of things, touch on them, but we have access to a lot of these trainings, like gender. I believe we do have, and Angela, you're probably better equipped, but a lot of it is more optional, I think. But I'm happy to let Angela take from Mark's point of view what is available, but there's definitely a lot of stuff there open to us to take.
Yep, thanks, Nick. And yes, I'll hand over to Ange. Ange, can you?
Yeah, so I just wanted to note that, the SRC and also student leaders in clubs and societies do receive gendered violence training via a module that was created by the Gendered Violence Research Network. But I also wanted to note that in the current strategy, it is included that we're going to be increasing first responder training for students like Nick, who are in representative roles and who are liaising with students on a really regular basis, because those students are often, women's officers and queer officers, and those people are often the peers that, if someone has experienced gendered violence, it's often those students that they want to go to speak to about these issues because they feel comfortable and safe with those students. So happily, that is in the gendered violence strategy, and hopefully SRC members in future will receive that training.
Great, thank you, Ange. That's really good to hear. And look, we're kind of coming towards the end of today's discussion. I just wonder if maybe we could just go around and just hear something about, there's obviously a massive problem in society generally around gender violence, harassment, assault, and so on. Huge changes need to be made. The university, as we've seen, the UNSW has been taking action for a number of years. The Gendered Violence Research Network has been a key part of that at UNSW. We now have a new updated gendered violence strategy and action plan for the next few years at UNSW. We've heard a bit about some of the content of that, about the importance of communication, the importance of getting everybody involved, the importance of getting men involved, both students and staff. But I just wanted to ask, I mean, do you see, or what kinds of positive signs of change do you see already that we can really build on in the next few years as part of our contribution to this strategy? Have things, I know that the recent national survey was very alarming and very disappointing to see that there is still such a hugely prevalent problem and it affects so many people in negative ways. But I guess I'm asking, are there signs nonetheless of a positive shift that we can build on? What do you think? Maybe Ange, I'll turn to you first. What do you think are the other signs of something?
I definitely think there are signs. I graduated at the end of last year, but I've been at university since 2016 because, I did it very slowly.
And well,
I think
slowly, you did it slowly and well.
Thank you very much. But yeah, I think just looking at this panel as well, it's so great to see young men being really engaged and active in this conversation. Vincent and Nick, I'm really glad to be on a panel with you guys. And I think when you look at student representatives at the moment, they're really great. They're really engaged and they're really passionate. And I think it's such a good indication of how much students care about this issue, and not just the women's officers and the queer officers, but also the general secretaries and regular students as well, like Vincent, who's not on an SRC and not on a PGC or anything like that. I think that this is an issue that really matters to the UNSW community broadly, and conversations like this really show that.
Thank you, Ange. Thank you, and maybe I'll turn to you now, Vincent. What kind of signs, positive signs, hopeful signs do you see?
Well, I can't really talk about long-scale changes at university itself because I've only been at university for a few years now. But sort of going back to that homogenous group of boys I was talking about earlier, a lot of the behavior that I would now see as problematic has improved significantly, over some people that I used to associate with. Not that it was horrible behavior or anything, but it was just some small microaggressions, I guess you could say. And I think that men in general are taking really great steps to improve the way they respond to these sorts of things. So I would say I'm definitely seeing positive change, at least within my groups. I can't speak for men as a whole, actually, but with my friends group and with the men I know in my life, I think there's definitely been positive change. And I'm very hopeful for the future of how we treat these issues as men as well.
Great. Thank you, Vincent. And Nick, what do you see from your perspective?
I'd say, I guess, and it's almost an external to the SRC and even the university, but also it's within it. The levels of kind of activism around this issue is really heartening. I know in the March for Justice, there was a lot of men present, which was great to see. And, you know, there's a lot of people that are quite visibly now doing a lot of good things, like the Women's Collective at the SRC. They're doing a lot of fantastic stuff. The Women's Officer IR, really fantastic stuff. And so I guess if there's just a prominence of activism in this space, which I guess it is, you know, it's a positive sign, and hopefully it continues that way.
Thank you, Nick. And finally, Mei-Lin, from your position as a number of years, I don't know how many years, a number of years in the GBRN.
Yes.
Sorry?
No, that's fine. 5 years.
5 years. What do you see then as hopeful signs of improvement that we can build on?
A lot of the activism that Nick and Vincent are talking about, and also Ange, started with the release of the video, The Hunting Ground, and students taking up this issue. Obviously, on a national scale, the issues are much more public with the responses from the Human Rights Commission, the Respect at Work response, definitely Grace Tame and Brittany Higgins raising issues, so many of the Aboriginal women, Hannah McGlade, raising these issues as well and making them very public, and also our co-convener at the Gender Violence Research Network, Kylie Cripps at the university. I think that it is the National Community Attitudes Survey that gives us an indication of how attitudes are changing. And we do have, we're lucky in Australia to have community attitudes being collected, and we can note changes. There's still work to do, but I think it's really important to track that. And so it's those social norms that we're still paying attention to. But I even saw something just recently, and you may have picked this up, about resource strategies like the Man Box, which is I would commend to people to take a look at, but just a way of framing those types of social norms that can trap men in those ideas, those older ideas about masculinity. And really we're talking about people breaking out of those ideas. So a lot of community resources is what I'm saying, as well as the initiatives at UNSW are taking us to a new place. And I think that's a respectful place.
Great. Thank you, Mei-Lin. That's great to hear. And yes, indeed, there are so many resources which hopefully are available. We can make more available, links to them through GBRN and the EDI at UNSW. So look, we've run out of time today. I really want to say a very big thank you to our panel members. It's been wonderful to have this discussion with you. Thank you very much for agreeing to join the panel. The contributions have been fantastic. And a big thank you to the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Attila Brungs, who joined us at the beginning of the session and launched the UNSW's new UNSW Gendered Violence Strategy and Action Plan. That action plan is available for all staff and students at the university to look at. It will be on, I assume, the GBRN website, and or no, it will be on the EDI website. So UNSW's Equity, Diversity and Inclusion website, you will be able to find that. It's a really fantastic document, incredibly detailed, really, really inspiring document. And I'm sure staff and students at the university will join in contributing to implementing the objectives of that document. So thanks again to everybody. We'll leave it there for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.